Okay, so today we're going to talk about factor 5, which is my own addition to the 4 factors of medical trauma. And this one is the sociocultural impacts or factors that influence a person's susceptibility to medical trauma. Sociocultural factors basically means that there are social determinants of health that can impact our susceptibility to medical trauma, and cultural influences, which can include political beliefs. It can include generally our society's views on things at the time that we're in need of medical care. And there's some other factors that kind of would get grouped into this, which could include some personal factors like religious beliefs and practices, or a person's political affiliations, gender and sexual orientation, disability status, etc., within the greater scope and context of what's going on in the world today, in our culture, the belief systems within it, and the political sphere. So essentially, the factors that are in this group are things like race, things like ethnicity, things like disability status, gender, sexual orientation, gender presentation, and sexual orientation, religious beliefs and practices, things like our socioeconomic status, and I'm trying to think if there's anything I'm leaving out. I would also include in here like body status and shape. Things like fat phobia can come out a lot in medical care as well. So some notable things to include in here, and I am sure I'm going to be leaving out other things that are pertinent, and I will come back to them. Feel free also to comment things, because I know collectively we have a greater scope of contribution to these factors, because I certainly don't represent all lived experiences, and there are so many lived experiences that would come out in this category. But some of the things that I think about are things like our culture right now around trans rights and just LGBTQIA issues in general, gender presentation, and sexual orientation. All of these things right now are in the midst of a cultural war, and it's largely revolving around access to appropriate health care, gender affirming care, etc. So this is going to mean that it is more likely for a person who belongs to that disenfranchised group to experience medical trauma in the healthcare system. If you are a person of color, there is a long, terrible history of being disenfranchised by the healthcare system and just by people in positions of power in general. I mean, if we think to different things that have happened in our history that have led to a collective distrust by people of color of medical professionals, medical environments, there is a collective trauma that happens there. And I think that trauma, that distrust, that vulnerability will also lead to people of color being more likely to experience medical trauma. I think also just the fact that there's so much of a disadvantage when it comes to healthcare access by race and geographic location. People in the South in certain areas don't have access to adequate health care, and that's going to impact their susceptibility to medical trauma. Another factor is if you're an immigrant or an asylum seeker, maybe you're in a position where you have been forced into immigration and there's a language barrier. You're also going to have access to care issues because of that. And also there's just such chronic stress surrounding not only trying to just figure out how to live day to day in a new country where there's like mountains of red tape and other barriers, administratively speaking, but then trying to figure out how to get adequate health care on top of that. Getting translators and things is going to make it more likely that you're going to experience medical trauma in the healthcare system. If you are a disabled person, it's going to be harder to access healthcare depending on your disability and what your needs are in order to access a healthcare environment, to access a provider. There are so many different ways that could play out that it's very nuanced. But being a person living with a disability can also create barriers to actually getting healthcare. And there are some reasons that span across all these groups why a person might be more likely to experience medical trauma. Things like if you're a member of a disadvantaged or disenfranchised group, you are going to have a harder time having good social support, right? That's kind of the very nature of being a member of a disenfranchised group, is that there are fewer of you, right? Fewer people who can relate to what it's like to be in that group. There's going to be fewer people who recognize what the needs are. And it's going to be, the system is set up in such a way that it's not designed with you in mind. It's designed for the majority group, the normative group, the able-bodied group, all of those things. It is a systemic problem that trickles down, and anyone who doesn't fit into that box, so to speak, is going to have a harder time accessing care within that system. There's also the fact that, politically speaking, when you are not in the majority, if you are a member of a disenfranchised group, usually in our nation's history, what we've seen happen is that policies get created to preserve and protect and perpetuate that system staying the way it is and continuing to not serve the people who are disenfranchised, the people who are in most need of having policies created to protect them and to protect their right to access these systems. People don't do that. They fight to perpetuate and keep the system the way it is because the people who are in the majority benefit from it staying that way. So as you can see, these are factors that are largely out of the control of who it trickles down to, which are the most vulnerable in our society, the most disenfranchised, the people who have the worst health outcomes. It's largely in part to the way our systems are set up that keep getting perpetuated. So I wanted to bring this in as a fifth factor because I think it's important to remember that this very much plays into a person's experience and likelihood of experiencing medical trauma when they try to seek out appropriate and adequate healthcare.